Welcome to Lecture 7. Until this point, we have been looking exclusively at sacred music, that is, music which is connected with the church. This will be the first lecture in which we do take a pretty hard look at secular music, and we already defined polyphony in our last lecture, so here we're going to be talking about secular monophony of the medieval period. Monophony meaning single line of sound, or music in this case. The groups that we'll be studying are the goliards, the troubadours, and the trouvères. And here I have some graphics just to show you guys how these people were depicted in medieval times. The goliards and the troubadours and trouvères all were traveling minstrels of some sort, and they had rather different beginnings and rather different reputations. But here on the right, you can see someone who's pretty much dressed as a troubadour would be, in red clothing, which would have been extremely costly at the time with gold lining. So we can assume this person might have been noble and been attached to some money. On the left-hand side, we have a goliard who is dressed in rather humble clothing. Looks like he might actually be a monk, in fact, from the way that he's dressed. And he is playing an instrument and singing as well, looking a bit sad. You'll find out that both of these depictions are quite accurate in terms of the people that they represent. So let's move on and learn a bit about these folks. The graphic on this slide is actually a depiction of the goddess Fortune. This is in fact a depiction from the manuscript Carmina Burana. If you look at Fortune here in the very middle circle, she is holding a wheel. And if you look carefully at the figures around the wheel, you can see some are tumbling down to their death to be crushed under Fortune's wheel, while others are hanging onto the wheel and are on the rise back up to become king. So there was a great fascination with this ancient pagan goddess, and the goliards, who you'll learn about in just a moment, truly believed in her. So a bit of historical background about them. The Great Schism of 1054 strikes a really big chord of fear into the Western Christian Church. And from this point onward, the Church is extremely vigilant about anything that could be considered a heretical belief, or any belief that strayed from Church doctrine. The Church is really attempting to educate the populace to believe whatever the right thing is, and if one is found to be in error, dogma and doctrine become extremely important. And you must remember as well, ladies and gentlemen, this is a time where there is no separation between church and state. So the Church was part of the ruling body. God, of course, is always involved in everything, both in our lives today and in our lives then, whether by relationship of church or love or other ways. And as a continuation of that, when Constantine established the Christian religion as legitimate, many medieval students flocked to monasteries in hopes of climbing what we would call the church corporate ladder. One could begin as a monk and sometimes rise up the ladder to become a cardinal or a bishop, which was a very secure position with a lot of finances attached to it. This is also a flowering period for intellect. Much new literature is being written. Epics such as King Arthur, Tristan and Isolde, and Roland the Crusading Knight were also being widely translated into the vernacular language, whatever that was in a particular area. Latin, however, is still considered the language of the learned, in which one would argue a court case, write to a king or a noble lord, or praise a lover. So this is the educated language. That being so, there is a lot of Latin poetry which is being written at this flowering intellectual period. Most of the secular Latin poetry that we know of comes from two sources: the monasteries of southern France, that's where we found much of it, and the much debated Goliard poets. This graphic has a great deal to do with the medieval perception of the Garden of Earthly Delights, which actually, believe it or not, has a great deal to do with the goliards. So, who the goliards were, first of all. They were a group of wandering students who originally had been intending on careers in the monastery, and they'd become disenchanted with monastery life. So they simply left and lived on the streets and lived on foot. Life on foot was very difficult, but these students had become so disillusioned with the church that taking their chances on the outside seemed a better option than playing the politics on the inside. And when I say that, I want you to be aware that there was a great deal of hypocrisy in the church at this time. The students would have heard sermons that are preached on poverty, chastity, and good works, and then seen money coming into the church buying earthly pleasures, as well as indulgences and positions of power in the church. An indulgence, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, is when the church forgives a mortal sin, or actually could be any sin, but usually the bigger the better. You would pay them a certain fee and then they would give you a piece of paper saying that your sin was forgiven and you would not be required to be in purgatory for it. So faced with a lot of competition and unfairness and hypocrisy in the church, many students despaired of ever achieving any position other than what they were. Other goliards were simply dropouts from medieval society who expressed their anger and frustration in very scorching satire and parody. Nothing was sacred to the goliards. Hymns and church services would regularly receive colorful and amusing jabs. In fact, one monk parodied the benediction, "God be with you," to "Fraud be with you." The origin of the name Goliard is probably derived from a couple of different sources. A lot of contemporaries believe that the name came from the word gula, which is Latin for gluttony. Eating and drinking and having sex were often very favored subjects in this repertory. It also may have come from the famous Goliath of the Battle of David and Goliath. He was called Golias in the Vulgate Latin. He was considered a monster and an agent of the devil, so therefore, to the church at least, he would seem a fitting hero for these bawdy and irreverent poets. Any monk who was living by his wits in the street could be referred to as a goliard, and again, goliards were also dropouts, homeless people from medieval society. Some goliards, however, were fortunate enough to be supported by rich patrons. The archpoet Goliard was supported by the Archbishop of Cologne, Germany, and that was a fortunate case. Most goliards, however, would wander the streets begging for money or earning it by entertaining with their songs. The texts of songs actually could be quite varied, depending upon who the audience was. If a commoner walked by and said, "Oh, Goliard, give me a song," quite often the subjects would revolve around drinking and songs about hypocritical clergymen. However, if a noble walked by and said, "Oh, Goliard, give me a song," quite often the Goliard would sing about love or something of a more philosophical nature. This last Goliard graphic, also from Carmina Burana, depicts the weaving of a loom. Once again, the goddess Fortune is involved with this on the right-hand side, weaving the loom of destiny. The Goliards often spoke of her and how they believed she was truly involved in what was going to happen to them, that it had nothing to do with God and that it was her fault when something went wrong. So I've been referring back and forth to this Carmina Burana manuscript. What is it? In the late 13th century, a Benedictine monk in Buren of Bavaria collected some 200 Goliardic poems into an anthology which is now known as Carmina Burana. That means Songs of Buren. In the 20th century, this was set to music by Carl Orff, so if you guys have ever heard that piece, the poems are medieval, the music is from the 20th century. So this collection contains poems mostly by French and German Goliards, and subjects again will range from the Crusades to begging for food, the corrupt practices of the church, to the delights of physical love in springtime. So it really could run the gamut. This manuscript was first made publicly available in 1847 after being kept necessarily hidden for centuries because the church didn't want people to know that monks wrote these naughty, naughty poems and naughty, naughty music. The kinds of poems that one finds in the writings of the Goliards is medieval secular Latin poetry. This is quite different from classical or original Roman Latin. Classical Latin is based upon a strict observance of metrical patterns, while medieval Latin is based upon a regular pattern of accented and unaccented syllables, such as long, short. Talked a little bit about that in the previous lecture. Medieval Latin also contained the repetition of similar or identical sounds at the end of verse. Example of that, if any of you actually have heard Carmina Burana, the opening piece has this text: O fortuna velut luna, statu variabilis semper crescis. So extremely similar sounds and rather short in terms of the syllables. These very bawdy songs were frowned upon by the church, understandably, while love songs to the Virgin Mary were encouraged. That actually spawns another movement. The anti-Goliard sentiments produced clerics who venerated the Virgin in a way that she had never been venerated before. And in fact, the veneration of the Virgin Mary today really begins in this time in the medieval period. Ladies and gentlemen, there is no goliard poetry or music in your anthologies, which I think is a loss, and I would like to play you a piece which I actually researched and sang in one of my doctoral recitals. It's called O Varium Fortunae, which means O Variable Fortune, and is again a lament at how quickly fortune will lift someone up and then bring them crashing down in the next few moments. Lovely piece, again taken from Carmina Burana, and this is in fact sung by myself. Here you go. The drone that you hear is in fact an organ drone, and it's quite possible that drones were used in these goliard songs, especially if there was a stringed instrument around that had that capability of an open fifth. Helps with tuning. Moving on now from the goliards to the troubadours. And this graphic I have here for you, ladies and gentlemen, is a representation of Frederick of Sicily, about whom we will learn much more. He was a very well-known nobleman and became king of the second consolidation of the Holy Roman Empire. You'll notice he's holding a fleur de lis, which is the well-known symbol of France. His actual crown, in fact, resembles a fleur de lis. The bird that is down by his right side is an eagle, which is symbolism of truth and wisdom. So a bit of historical background about the troubadours. Between 800 and 1300, secular power in France centralizes, and the King of France, who is really, in fact, the King of Paris, and his court become more powerful at the expense of local lords. After the era of Charlemagne, feudalism truly begins in earnest. This is a system in which land is given by the king or the noble lord in exchange for the promise of local lords to fight for him in the case of war. This is called swearing an oath of fealty. And the peasants who served the lords underneath the main lord had almost nothing. They swore an oath of fealty to the lesser lord, who would then in turn swore an oath of fealty to the greater lord. So everything works in favor of who's on top of this particular system. In 1066, the Battle of Hastings and the Norman Conquest occurred. What this was a very important battle in which the Normans, who are more or less French, cross the English Channel and invade England. And for political reasons, for the next 400 years, England and France become locked in a battle of who is going to rule England and parts of France. There is also a conflict between the languages. The English begin speaking Anglo-Saxon, which is a form of German, but with the influence of the Normans, French becomes the language of the court. Eventually, our modern-day English becomes a blend of German and then a few Latin roots from French. If that all weren't enough, then we have a second consolidation of the Holy Roman Empire. In 1198, the Norman King Frederick of Sicily, who was known by many who didn't support him as the pretender to the throne, much like Bonnie Prince Charlie was several hundred years later, is crowned Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope, in a similar situation that Charlemagne had where the Pope needed help. King Frederick was a fine intellectual who spoke and read both Arabic and Hebrew, rather uncommon thing to do at that time. He also lived a very eclectic lifestyle. He had a harem and also had many Muslim friends, so he was a quite worldly leader. In fact, with all of his connections, Frederick might have been able to stop the Crusades, but instead laid claim to Italy and parts of Germany and France as he wanted to further his own political aspirations. This graphic should assist you in understanding a bit about the geography of France as we know it today and France in the medieval period. France is still in a region by itself, even in the medieval period, so Frederick of Sicily decided to split the country into northern and southern portions that were not ruled by the French king, who mostly lived in Paris and didn't really travel much. The northern portion was known as the Langue d'Oui, and the southern portion was known as the Langue d'Oc. This had to do with how both cultures said the word yes. The northern French said oui, which becomes oui in modern French, and the southern French said oc. So the northern portion was known as the langue d'oui, the langue where they say oui, the language where they say oui, and the southern portion was known as the language where they say oc. The southern portion was also known as Occitan. Today, Occitan is near modern-day Provence and made up at this point of a renegade band of individual monarchs and duchies. The closest living language to Occitan today would be Catalonian, which is spoken still in southern France and northern Spain. This area had really wonderful vineyards and became pretty wealthy early on in its history, selling their wines to other regions. So there was a good deal of merchantry and trading that went on, and this contributed to a very rich culture. So the southern portion of France, known as the Languedoc or Occitan, is where the gestation of secular monophony occurs. This is the first large-scale vernacular love poetry in the history of medieval Europe that we're aware of. It had three different periods. The early period was from 1080 to 1150. The middle period was from 1150 to 1250, so about 100 years, and the late period from 1250 to 1300 is cut off by the Albigensian Crusade, which we'll discuss later. This repertory was composed and performed by a group of nobles whom we call the troubadours. And troubadour, what is that? It comes from the verb troubar, which is Occitan for to find or to fashion. In this case, we're fashioning something into poetry or song. Troubadours were an important part of the nobility in southern France, and lords would often invite them into their homes as guests. Also, many members of the nobility were troubadours. One of the first troubadours of any significance that we know is William XI, Guillaume XI, who was the Duke of Aquitaine, and he was quite famous for his poems that he wrote. Artistic pursuit is still associated with the highest level of society at this point, and unlike many other regions, would not be considered effeminate or diminish the position of the noble. They've sort of thrown away all of that Platonic philosophy that we've talked about. This is a very progressive society where women are not only not considered to be the downfall of man, but are held up as objects of love and affection. There also were many Muslims living alongside of Christians, which was unusual at the time as well. This area is truly unique in many ways, and it's important here to show courtly society that you have the refinement it takes to write poetry and music. Here we have yet another example of a troubadour in a medieval manuscript playing the medieval fiddle, as it was known in this time. Looks a bit like our modern-day violin. However, the strings are tuned so that they can drone very easily, and that's usually how it was used. It's very difficult to play a melodic line on a medieval fiddle. It also is somewhat more squat in terms of its shape and has a shorter neck than you might expect, as well as being played with a bow that looks a lot more like a bow and arrow than our modern bow. A few terms to familiarize yourself with as we study the troubadours. One of the first I'd like to introduce you to is amour fin, which means courtly love. And this was love between a noble lady and some sort of poet or servant from the lower classes, normally meaning a troubadour. Troubadours were noble, however there were different levels of nobility, so they normally weren't at the very top. This was extremely refined love poetry, this courtly love poetry, very different from the goliards, an extremely sublimated version of love instead of the down-to-earth sort of physical love that the goliards spoke of. So the idealized lady is chosen and written about and for, and a troubadour would often give her his poems in secret, of course. There is always an obstacle between the lady and the poet, such as social standing, or perhaps the lady is married. The lady, therefore, is never truly attainable, and she can be put onto a pedestal, while the poet sort of looks at her from afar and is in constant anguish. In general, when one writes about ladies of the court, one would not speak about physical love or consummation. Therefore, the relationship is almost never consummated. Courtly love has a bit of artifice to it for that reason, and is not entirely as serious as it might seem, but it certainly has its effect all the way into the 20th century. And this concept of troubadour culture later affects northern France and the rest of Europe. Other terms that have to do with troubadour song: troubard clos, which means to write in a closed or a secretive fashion. And this term is usually reserved for poetry or song of a serious or complex nature, such as the lady and her admirer and the fact that they cannot be together. There's also usually a great deal of imagery and allegory in this kind of poetry. Then there is the senhal, which means signal. This is part of a secret code that only the lady and the poet would understand. The poet might refer, for example, to the lady as a lily in his poem and her husband as the jealous one. Then there is also troubadour, which means to write in a lighter, more humorous fashion, and that's usually reserved for poems of a lighter, more humorous tone, such as the story of the knight and the shepherdess. And this is very common in troubadour poetry. A knight walks along in a field and sees a beautiful shepherdess tending her flock and says, "Hey, how would you like to go behind the bushes with me?" And she normally refuses him, but in a very clever verbal fashion, so they have a bit of a verbal sparring match. Since troubadours were of noble birth, they were usually not paid with money for their music. This would have been an insult, but they might have been given tokens, such as very nice cloaks or pieces of jewelry or a horse. But a troubadour of noble birth, however, might have in his employ a street musician called a jongleur, who would have been paid. Jongleur translates as juggler, and the jongleurs were more or less street performers or musicians. They would circulate the poetry and music of their noble lord so that everyone could hear it. Usually the jongleurs knew how to sing, and as well as that, they could usually play the fiddle. They learned music entirely by ear, they did not read it, and they taught songs to other people. They were also famous for their narrative epic poetry, which was called chanson de geste, or a song of deeds. And the most famous of these chansons de geste was the Song of Roland, who was the crusading knight. The graphic I have on this slide is meant to depict the Albigensian Crusade, which you will learn about on this slide finally. The troubadour songs that we have today were usually preserved in what were called chansonnières, which is a songbook, and were written as commemorative events usually by the troubadours and then actually copied down by the scribes at court. The troubadours themselves probably would not have actually written them down. The lute would be the accompanying instrument of choice for this repertory, and we believe that that is so because the lute originally came from Arab culture. The Arab instrument, the al-oud, which means wood in Arabic, came to southern France via Morocco, and Occitan had a joint appreciation for the culture and music of the Muslims, so it makes sense that they might have cultivated this instrument if they sang things with an instrument. Could have all been a cappella. Some characteristics of troubadour song. Generally what you're going to see are stepwise melodies, very complex intellectual poetry written by nobility, often with political commentary, very few phrase repetitions, free rhythms, which are not really folk-like at all, and the songs themselves are usually strophic, so they're very simple in terms of their makeup. The civilization of Occitan was in fact destroyed by a terrible event called the Albigensian Crusade. It was called that because it began in the city of Albi in southern France. And the crusade was, again, as I said, Christians against other Christians. The Pope and several of the northern French nobles decided that they had had enough of southern French heresy, which involved a group of people called Cathars. They were Gnostic Christians, they were vegetarians, and they were simply called the Cathari, or the pure ones, because they were very pure in their lifestyles, and they believed in a triple type of baptism, burial, and marriage ceremony. So there was really quite a lot of their Gnostic Christianity that has been lost to us today. But the Catholic Church would not tolerate another belief system which was claiming to be Christianity but was not their version of it. So therefore, they went on a very terrible crusade down to southern France and murdered a lot of the population. In fact, 3/4 of the people were wiped out. And it was said that when they went into a particular city, I believe it was Carcassonne in your map a few slides ago, that the Pope's underling said, "Kill them all, God will know who the faithful ones were." So this is a very terrible crusade that ended a lot of life in southern France and ended a lot of the troubadour culture. Now let's talk about some music. The first example I'd like to tell you about is in your Nom anthologies by Bernhard de Ventadorn, who is probably one of the most famous troubadours of his time, Quand vai la lausette mover. And if you listen to this, you'll notice it is strophic. And what I'd like to point out, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, is the text, because you have a text that's very, very sophisticated. This is one of the perfect examples of a song which is of the courtly love vein. When I see the lark beating its wings joyfully against the sun's rays, which then swoons and swoops down because of the joy in its heart, oh, I feel such jealousy for all those who have the joy of love, that I am astonished that my heart does not immediately melt with desire. This is very common in this kind of poetry. You'll get a beautiful description of a natural setting or something of nature which is quite lovely, and then a very sad personal feeling in contrast to that. Now verse 2 is really what tells us that this is a canso. Alas, I thought I knew so much of love, and I know so little, for I cannot help loving a lady from whom I shall never obtain any favor. There you go. The lady who is unachievable, unattainable, and yet he loves her anyway. She has taken away my heart and myself and herself and the whole world, and when she left me I had nothing left but desire and a yearning heart, etc., etc. And he goes on for several more verses like this. I would like to point out something which is a very political in commentary. It tells us which level of society this was for. In the third verse, the last couple of lines, "For I caused my own ruin just as fair Narcissus caused his by looking in the fountain." This reference to Greek mythology is something that only the educated noble circles will have understood at the time. So it really tells us this was intended for a very educated audience. This language, Occitan, you'll notice it's sort of a cross between French and Spanish if you're a language buff at all. And I also would like to point out a couple of things that I've spoken about in previous slides. When he talks about the lark beating its wings joyfully against the sun's rays, that very well could be a senhal. So the lark could perhaps be the lady, and the sun's rays could perhaps be the poet, so that they are mingling together in this poem. The second example I'd like you guys to take a look at, the next one, A Chantar. This is by a troubadourite, which is a female troubadour. And she has a different take. Still much of the same feelings, but you get a different sense of what it's like to be a woman in this time period. This song is going to sound a lot more folkish to your ears, I think. And she says, "To sing I must of that which I would rather not. So bitter I am towards him who is my love. For I love him more than anyone. My kindness and courtesy make no impression on him, nor my beauty, my virtue, or my intelligence. So I am deceived and betrayed, as I should be, as if I were unattractive." That tells us that attractiveness in this time period was valued beyond virtue or intelligence. So that's a very interesting point of view from a woman that we're getting at this time period. Comtesse de Dia was the wife of the Count de Dia, and we don't really know much about her. We know very little about the vidas or lives of any of the troubadours because there's just so little information and so little land documents that tells us anything useful. Be sure and read the anthology's comments about this because you will see a bit more of a form than simply strophic in this case, which we will definitely talk about when we get to trouvères, song and poetry. So here we are on our second to last slide, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for hanging in with me here. I also have a few other composers on this graphic to show you just to see who falls where. And you will see some of these names in a few lectures. You haven't seen all of them yet, but Perotin and Leonin hopefully look familiar. And the next composer I'll be telling you about is Adam de la Halle, once I explain a little bit about the trouvères. So I discussed the Albigensian Crusade in the previous slide, so you now know that the troubadour culture was pretty much destroyed, and any remaining troubadours scattered to other countries where troubadour traditions are formed, such as in Spain, the Cantigas de Santa Maria, and also in Germany, the Minnesingers and the Meistersingers. And we'll be talking about them a little bit later. In northern France, the former troubadours become known as trouvères. Trouvère means to find or to fashion, but in the medieval French, which is much more like modern French today. So the trouvère repertory of songs and poetry developed much later than the troubadour, the obvious impulse for that being that the people from the north had to learn what the people from the south had done. A few different types of trouvère song. This should sound very similar to troubadour song, just with a bit of a different accent. The chanson, which was known in the troubadour tradition as a canso, sad song usually based upon courtly love tradition of longing for an unattainable lady. The aoba, or alba, in troubadour culture. Subject matter is the same as in an alba. It's a watchman's song, watching under the window of the friend who is upstairs with his mistress. The troubadours tended to be more sensual and less humorous, whereas the trouvères were the reverse, much less sensual and more humorous about the whole affair. There's also the lai, which is a narrative song that tells a story, somewhat like the chanson de geste of the troubadours, and the pastourelle, which is sort of like the tenso of the troubadours, involves a debate or a dialogue. These pastourelles are actually so popular that eventually they become secular musical plays, kind of similar to what happened with the trope in church becoming the liturgical drama. An example of a trouvère song, which actually comes from one of these secular musical plays that I was just referring to, is by Adam de la Halle, who is on your graphic here as a composer. And the song is called Robin m'aime, or Robin Loves Me. And you'll notice this is extremely different in terms of its poetry compared to troubadour song. It's much, much simpler. So let's take a look at that. It's on page 46 in your noms. And let's take a look at this poetry. Robin loves me. Robin has me. Robin asked me if he can have. Robin bought me a skirt of scarlet, good and pretty, a bodice and a belt. Hooray! Robin loves me. Robin has me. Robin asked me if he can have me. So this is very, very simple poetry. It's nothing like, for example, the lark beating its wings and the sun shining its rays that we saw in the Bernhard de Ventador song. So that's one way you could tell this is a trouvère song instead of a troubadour song. Also, by the way, guys, Robin and Marian, which are being referred to in this song, this is not Robin and Marian of Robin Hood. It's simply a shepherd and a shepherdess, and those were just popular names at this time. One thing I do want to point out to you about this song is that it is in a particular form called a rondeau. This is one of the forme fixe, or the fixed forms that the troubadours came up with, and then are put into songs. These are used many times in history afterwards as well as during this time. The other two types of forme fixe are called the virelai and the ballade, and we'll talk more about them in another lecture. But for now, let's take a look at this song and you can see the pattern. The first four measures, I would like you to mark in your scores that that is large A. This is the first time we hear this music and the first text we hear it with. Robin m'aime, Robin m'aime. The next six phrases. Robin m'a demandé si m'aimera. That is to be marked as large B. First time we hear that music, it's different than what we heard before, and the first time we have that text. Then we have something which is pretty similar to what we just heard. Robin m'a cata cotelle, d'escalade, bonne et belle. Those should both be marked as a small a, because they are the same music but different words than we had with large A. Then, after those two small a's, Suscani chanturella riva. That should be a small b. Same music as we had before as the B section, but with different words. Then we have the same thing over again. Robin m'aime, Robin m'aime, Robin m'a demandé si m'aimera. So once again, another large A and another large B. So the total form of this song then is large A, large B, small a, small b, large A, large B. And this is kind of similar to the form of a chantar that we spoke about on the previous slide, AAB. A chantar is much simpler, but this rondeau form is very popular in the medieval period and continues on even after this. The last comment I'd like to make about this piece, you may have noticed we are in a meter now, a triple meter. The reason we believe that this was occurring is because now in Paris they have discovered triple meter with the modal system, and we believe that was transferred over into secular culture with the trouvères. So this is another way you can always tell a trouvère from a troubadour song. Trouvère songs might actually be in a meter rather than in a very sort of folk melody without any real rhythms attached to it. This last slide, ladies and gentlemen, is just to give you a comparison between the troubadours and the trouvères to keep everything straight. I just wanted to be clear on the language part of this. When I say language for the troubadours is Languedoc, Occitan, or Provençal, that would be medieval Provençal. The language that they spoke was known by all three of these names, whereas the northern French spoke the langue d'oïl, or medieval French. Everything else is fairly clear, but I just wanted to be certain you understood that. Thank you for listening.